Well, the U.S. House of Representatives has just voted to reauthorize the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, or FISA. Essentially, this extends the government's power to warrantlessly wiretap Americans for another 5 years. The vote was 301 to 118, mostly along party lines, but with more than 70 Democrats voting in favor of it and fewer than 10 Republicans voting against it. The bill was discussed for about an hour today under closed rule, which means no amendments were able to be offered. There's a minor issue, though. There's a whole lot that both we and they, those who voted for it, don't know about it. Like, for example, how many Americans will be surveilled, or how who is surveilled is determined. I'm joined by Alan Butler now, Appellate Advocacy Counsel with Epic. And Alan, let's talk about the significance of this. I mean, what does this mean?
Basically what it means is that it moves along, the FISA reauthorization moves along through the process. The Senate hasn't yet voted to reauthorize the bill, so that still needs to happen. But at this point, as you mentioned, no amendments have been offered, and so the type of reporting, oversight, and privacy protections that are necessary to really make this law uphold civil liberties have not yet been introduced.
We should mention something that a lot of people don't know, which is that FISA was first passed back in 1978 by Jimmy Carter, but changed a lot under the Bush administration post 9/11. Talk a little bit about some of the most important elements that were added to this piece of legislation.
Sure. Well, the FISA Amendments Act of 2008, which is being voted on today by the House to reauthorize, changed the FISA system in a significant way. So the way that the FISA had worked since the 1970s was that agents of foreign powers or foreign powers who were abroad and not domestic could be targeted with a warrant from the FISA court. And that warrant basically was granted upon the government confirming that an individual, some reasonable suspicion that the individual was abroad and not a U.S. person. But what the FAA added was a system of programmatic surveillance, where the government could apply for authorization to conduct a program of surveillance whereby they would collect a large number of communications, and subject to certain minimization and targeting procedures, they would collect those communications in the hopes that they would target foreign persons, but not identified persons.
Right. I think that's really important to add. It just seems to me, Alan, it's a post 9/11 world. Yesterday was the anniversary of those attacks on 9/11 that really changed a lot of the way this country conducts business, I guess you could say. But it seems that what we saw today is Congress wanting to continue to tighten the screws here on this rather contentious piece of legislation. When does this change? When can we go back to a no FISA world?
Well, I think part of the problem is the lack of information. So you saw a lot in the debates on the floor today of talk, but no real facts. I mean, part of the problem here is that we have a lack of public reporting and accountability for this system. There's a lot of questions and not a lot of answers, and I think that we need those answers to really have a realistic discussion about the progression of this law.
I think that's a really important point, and there have been a couple people, journalists, who've filed Freedom of Information Act requests, tried to get some details. I know that when this was up for discussion before, Senator Ron Wyden wanted some information, a longtime member of the Senate Intelligence Committee, but that information is not being public, and yet this is a piece of legislation that will affect all citizens. How is this possible? I mean, is this not going against the Fourth Amendment to the Constitution?
I think part of the problem is that we haven't been able to answer that question yet. I mean, we have a court case that's going up to the Supreme Court this year challenging the FAA, and that's Clapper versus Amnesty. And that case could theoretically get kicked by the Supreme Court before it even gets to the merits of that question. Before it even is allowed to ask the question of whether it violates the Fourth Amendment, the individuals in that case, could theoretically have their decision reversed if the Supreme Court finds that they haven't provided enough information to show that their rights have been violated. So really, the lack of public information here is hindering not only the public's understanding of this system, but judicial review as well.
How did we get from point A to point B? And point A is 2005, a New York Times article came out disclosing exactly what this warrantless wiretapping was. The entire program, and from what I understand, they actually had this information in 2004 and held off on publishing it. They waited until after the election. So they published this. People are outraged. I remember when this came out. It was shocking. People couldn't believe that this would happen, but it's still was in place, voted on in 2008. Here we are in 2012. How did we get to this point where it just sort of gets pushed through?
I think a lot of...
Where's the outrage?
I think it's shocking because what's happening in the debate is people are representing that, there's no problem. There's no problem whatsoever. But I think there is a problem, and the problem is that we don't have any information about how many U.S. persons' communications have been intercepted under this authority. And, how did we get here? I think it was a slow process, sort of like turning up the heat and the water boiling slowly. I think that there was an urgency after 2005 to sort of provide some foreign intelligence authority when there was a sense, post-2005 that some capabilities had been lost and those were necessary to sort of fight terrorism. But in the reauthorization sweep, I think we went a bit too far, and then we've had a lack of oversight and public information available to sort of push back against that system.
When President Obama ran for president, he spoke out against warrantless wiretapping, and yet he seems to be in favor of the bill this time around. It's a difficult question, but it's an important one for, I think, Americans to think about, which is how does the president and future leaders as well sort of navigate these murky waters of keeping the country safe and also allowing Americans to maintain their civil liberties.
I think it's difficult, but I think that the Senate version of this bill currently actually has a number of substantial amendments that have been added to increase oversight and accountability and even public reporting. And I think that so far the administration's stance has been reauthorize the bill, which there's a decent amount of agreement on that that there are some necessary tools under FISA. But the question is, how do we shape the law? How do we shape the requirements for oversight and reporting? And how do we provide more notice and information to the public?
I think those are all really, really good questions, and I think that it's very hard. And I think that the most important thing that we have to point out today is that there's such little information about this, and yet it just passed in the House of Representatives. Alan Butler of Appellate Advocacy Council with EPIC. Appreciate having you on the show.
Thanks for having me.